So I'd like to talk today about climate change education and what does that do to students' perceptions of the world that's coming up for them. This talk was actually inspired by another speaker that you're going to hear in a little bit, Julian Pickris, who's actually kind of hiding right back there right now. Julian was a student in my exploratory science class last year, and after our unit on climate change, he started asking a lot of questions. Why is it that we don't know more about this? What's really going on? What can we do to be able to affect change in this space? And it really got me to thinking, this generation, the high schoolers in here, have grown up all the time knowing about climate change. This has been part of their vocabulary since they grew up. For those of us in the room like me, I'm old, I'm a boomer. No boomers in here. All right, I'm the oldest one in the room. We learned about climate change over a very long period of time. It's something that sort of slowly crept in to our national vocabulary. But for them, it's always been there. And so the question that I had to ask is, how does this affect their perceptions of the future that they look forward to? And so that's what I wanted to investigate. Now, our understanding of the link between climate change and fossil fuels has gone back for at least 100 years. This was in an article that appeared in Popular Science back in 1912 that asked the question, is burning coal changing our climate? Did this make it part of the national conversation? No, probably not. Go forward a little bit, 1930s, Popular Science again, lists an article that goes and talks about, is our climate changing? Is fossil fuel to blame for this? But again, is this part of the national conversation? Nah, not really at this point. If anything, it's probably just a little bit of a curiosity. You go from there through the 1940s, the war years. The 1950s, probably not much going on in terms of climate change research and climate change discussion. You move a little bit forward into the 1960s. The evolution of the modern environmental movement really didn't focus on climate and climate change. It was focused much more instead on air quality, water quality, land use issues, and really didn't focus on climate change. Now, in this time period, in the 70s, there was more and more scientific research being done about climate and climate change, but it really wasn't part of the national vocabulary. The 1980s comes along. This man, James Henson, he's a NASA scientist, and he started looking at how does the CO2 in Venus's atmosphere turn it into the hellscape that it is. Most metals will melt on the surface of Venus. Venus isn't hotter because it's that much closer to the sun. Venus is hotter because of its atmosphere. And so he turned his attention from studying Venus to studying Earth. How does the CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere start to affect our climate? And he finally ends up testifying in 1988 before Congress, including at that time, then Senator Al Gore. And he gives the Congress a pretty blunt assessment. Our climate is changing. Not it's going to, it is. And it's changing now, and it's going to change much more in the future. Does this necessarily then push climate change right into our national vocabulary? No, not entirely, but got to admit, front page of the New York Times, above the fold, this starts to bring climate change as something that we talk about as a society more to the forefront. Through the 90s, time of President Clinton, Vice President Al Gore, there's more discussion about climate change, but most of what goes on through the period of the 90s really pushes that back until we move into the 2000s. At that point, Al Gore, fresh off a presidential victory, decides to spend a little bit more time focusing on educating people about climate and climate change. And so first with a book, then followed up in a movie, An Inconvenient Truth, he starts really forcing climate change into the national conversation. This is where it really finally becomes part of everybody's vocabulary. But think about these high school students, most of whom were born 2000 to 2004. In 2006, they're what, at best, 6 years old? So how does having this part of the national vocabulary when you're still a child really start to affect your perceptions of the world, your perceptions of what your future is going to lead to. Which really kind of brings me to my basic premise. What do these students know about climate change? And does climate change education, presenting them the actual facts and evidence, using scientific reasoning, does this change their perception of climate change? And how might be different than my particular perception of climate change, being the old person that I am? So think about this group of students right here. Think about these 14, 15, 16-year-olds who, from the time that they are old enough to read the cover of a book, are reading about the end of ice. They're reading about the water is coming. They're reading, at least reading book covers, about temperature change, extinction. How does this change their perceptions about what kind of world they're going to grow up in? So, I'm a school educator, scientist, and I said, how do we tackle this problem? So what I decided to do was to turn around and take my existing exploratory science class, some of whom are here today. Thanks for coming out, guys. And use them as guinea pigs. And so what did I do as a good educator? I assessed, educated them, and then reassessed. How does that education change their perceptions? So these are the kinds of questions that I ask them. What is it? Do you know what it is? Do you know what the causes and effects are? Do you know whether there's an ability to be able to change anything? Do you know what we have to do to be able to affect the kind of change that we need? Ask those questions, educate them, and then re-ask these questions again to see how they've changed. And that was really my objective. Most importantly, and last on that list, is how does this make you feel? Does knowing the facts, does knowing the evidence, does knowing the consequences change how they feel about their future? And that was really sort of the big question. So, what did we learn? We focused on a variety of things. We looked at the causes of climate change and the feedbacks. We looked at what are the current evidence, what are the predictions of the future, and probably more importantly is what are the things that need to happen to be able to start to put control on our changing climate. So we started with the obvious. What are the mechanics of climate change? Looking at the energy budget of the Earth, the inflows and outflows of energy. The real problem, of course, is in the red circle right there. It's this back radiation. Greenhouse gases increasing the amount of energy coming back to the Earth. Now that they understand what is the actual process of climate change, we looked at the evidence, everything from CO2 emissions, CO2 concentrations, air temperature, water temperature, pretty much everything to do with ice, changes in habitat, changes in weather. From there, we started looking at where is this going? What does our future hold for us? And of course, the most important question that you have to ask when you're talking about what does our future hold for us is what actions are we going to take? And all the questions all come back to what are we going to do? Because what that future looks like depends upon what we choose to do. And again, we looked at everything: temperature, sea levels, precipitations, weather patterns, disease vectors, and so on and so on and so on. Then lastly, we looked at what do we have to do? What are the steps for mitigation that we need to be able to accomplish, to be able to put some control over the level of temperature increase that we're going to be looking at over the next 50 to 100 years? So I had them play a game. And the game comes from Princeton University, the Climate Mitigation Institute, and they developed this game called the Stabilization Wedges game. This is a game that they designed for policymakers. The policymakers can understand the scope and scale of the problem and be able to have rational discussions about what the choices are to be able to control our changing climate. I'm not going to point to too many graphs, but this is a few of them. In the red line, you can see the increase in global CO2 emissions per year, now topping out in excess of 8 gigatons per year. That's 8 billion tons of CO2, which we're putting into our atmosphere every year. And if we don't change our emissions behavior, follow the red dotted line up. And that's where we're headed, which would eventually lead to temperature increases from between 9 and 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Catastrophic consequence. So the first question you have to ask is, can we stabilize this at least? Can we stop increasing the amount of CO2 that we're putting into the atmosphere? And that's what's represented by the blue dotted line there. We've got to at least stop growing our emission. So that blue triangle up there, that whole big blue triangle, represents the amount of CO2 which we need to not emit in the next 50 years. That triangle represents 200 gigatons. That's 200 billion tons of CO2 which we need to not emit over the next 50 years. So, how do you do that? Well, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So the strategy of the stabilization game is to take this huge amount of CO2 that has to be eliminated and break it into 8 pieces or 8 wedges, hence the name of the game. Each one of those wedges, the blue wedges, represents 25 gigatons of carbon that won't be going into the atmosphere over the next 50 years. Does that stop climate change? No. It only stabilizes our emission. It doesn't stabilize our temperature. So in addition to that, they have to have another 4 wedges shown there in green. Excuse me. Those additional 4 wedges are what are needed to be able to start bringing our carbon emissions down to the point where the total increase in temperature over the next 50 years will only be held to 2 degrees C or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees C, that's the threshold above which we start really talking about catastrophic consequences. Below 2 degrees, are we still looking at significant changes? Absolutely. But we're starting looking at catastrophic consequences above that. So these 12 wedges which they need to come up with, what do they represent? They represent a lot of different things. Tripling the world's nuclear power plant capacity, cutting in half the number of vehicles on the road, and making every car twice as efficient as it is today. Making every building on the planet as efficient as possible. Covering the entire state of Texas with windmills, covering the entire state of Massachusetts with solar panels, and planting enough grass to be able to make ethanol that covers the entire country of India. Replacing 800, third of the world's capacity of coal-fired plants with gas-fired plants. Being able to establish 50 gigatons of carbon sequestration. And it's not which one of these do they have to choose between, because we don't need to do one of these things. We need to do all of them. So, that brings me to my premise. And my premise is, for this age of student who grows up in this environment, how does your education on these facts and evidence change your perceptions of the world in which you're growing up in? And how might that be different than mine or yours? And that was really sort of the premise that I started out looking at this. So again, my class as guinea pigs, I ask these questions. What do they know? How do they know it? Where do they get their information from? And then, again, the most important question is, how does this make them feel? So, here's the questions that I asked. How would you describe the extent to which you know what climate change means? Good students at South Fayette, a fair number of them had some idea. Before climate change education, after climate change education. The students are able to learn and understand that they have some idea of what climate change is. When asked the question about, do you believe that the climate of our world is changing? Some of them are quite uncertain. Before, after climate change education, those that they believe that the climate is changing, agree or strongly agree, accounts for almost 9 out of 10. When we look at this question of, what's the cause? This is what we hear all the time, right? Oh, I think the climate's changing, but it's just part of a natural cycle. The most recent evidence says that the probability that climate change is not happening and not caused by man, or flip that around, the probability that climate change is happening and caused by man has reached 5 sigma. Those of you in the business community understand the concept of 6 sigma. It has reached 5 sigma, which basically says the probability that climate change isn't happening and is not caused by man is now less than 1 part in 1 million. Good South Fayette students, after climate change education, after examining the facts and evidence, now understand that climate change is anthropogenic, or caused by man. Then we ask this question, can we do anything about the rate of climate change? Should we do anything about the rate of climate change? Some hesitancy, although good 3/4 of people say yes. After that, that percentage rises a bit. More interestingly, though, when you start getting to the question of, should governments require people to be able to make changes to be able to reduce our climate emissions? Quite a bit of disagreement. And interestingly enough, from before education to after education, not really much of a change. Instead, the students seem to favor voluntary measures to be able to put climate emissions under control. So from before to after education, you could see somewhat of a growth, but again, still not a huge change. So then I started asking questions about, how does this make you feel? So the question that I really asked was, to what extent are you excited about your future? In blue, shown before climate change education. In red, afterwards. Yeah, I'm sorry. I think climate change is a little bit of a wet rag on their excitement. Sorry about that, guys. A little bit of a shift to less excited about their future. But when you ask the question, are they fearful? An interesting result. Those that are very fearful or somewhat fearful actually declines. Well, at least in the very fearful. And those that are not fearful at all also declines. It's sort of a movement towards the middle. And I asked the next question, which was really about, are they enthusiastic? Interestingly enough, a movement towards very enthusiastic, with the exception of the top end of the scale. Then I asked the question, are they distressed? And I looked at this and I was a little surprised, given the other results. So very distressed over here to not distressed at all. And the interesting thing is the movement towards less stress, less distress about their future. Does this tell us that climate change education, while I may not like what I see, at least I understand it. At least I understand what needs to be done. And then probably most interestingly, as you move from there is, what does this mean you're going to do? So the last question that I asked was, does this make you feel called to action? So as an older adult, as a science teacher, as a human, I was very pleased to see this result. So while this group may not be particularly excited about their future or enthusiastic about their future, given what they're looking at, they're actually less stressed about it with more education. And they feel more called to action with more education. And that call to action is what's ultimately going to propel the changes that we need. In the UK, Europe, students are leaving class and going to the streets to protest. They are calling upon their governments to do more about climate and climate change. In the United States, Juliana versus the United States, a case that's being tried in Oregon, 10 high school and college students are suing the United States government because the United States government's lack of action on climate change is impinging upon their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This type of action, this type of call to action for this generation is what it's going to take to be able to create the changes that we need in our world. And really the question that you have to ask, can we change this image? Our future is in their hands. Thank you.